Do you have a speech coming up or you want to prepare for a speech and you're not sure what you should do? There's many things that we can do, but when it comes to having a speech prepared, should we memorize it? Should we not memorize it? Well, in today's episode, I am going to share with you how you should go about preparing for your speech when it comes to memorizing that speech. Do we want to memorize it or not? And the answer is kind of yes and no, but more aired on the side of no. But I'm going to give you some reasons why we don't want to actually memorize our speech rather than just giving you, well, it depends. So before we get into the reasons why you don't want to and giving you those negatives, and I'm going to give you 4 reasons for that, I really want to emphasize a little bit of the yes with this. So we want to memorize the stories that we're going to share, but maybe not completely. So when we think of memorization of a speech, we're thinking literally everything. So exactly everything you're going to say, how you're going to say it, the order you're going to say it, what stories you're going to share, and there's no real wiggle room. So the memorized portion that I want you to actually remember, and I suggest for my clients to remember as well, is actually the outline and the stories within that. So you have this overarching theme of what you're going to share, and you have some supporting points for that overarching theme. And that's amazing, and you should have that. But that's about all you should have, is that outline memorized and some ideas of the stories that you want to have. The stories that you have should be memorized in some way, shape, or form because you remember them. But you don't want to literally write everything out on a paper and then memorize that speech. And so when we're talking about memorization, that's typically what is thought about when it comes to memorizing a speech. But knowing the outline and memorizing that outline will be beneficial for you, so you have a roadmap to go down. So why don't we want to have a speech written out? Because you think about that, if I've written it out, if I've thought about it, have it on paper, I've seen it on paper, I've spoken it out, I've done all the practice and everything, why would I not want to do that? Well, there's 4 things. First of all, you don't want to have a memorized speech word for word written out, because when it comes time to actually presenting it, you're going to not be able to connect with your audience. And that's the hardest thing. If you have a speech completely memorized, now you're stuck doing that exact speech because that's what you memorized. That's what you practice time and time again. And therefore, you're not able to connect with the audience because, let's say you're going to a group of teenagers and you're trying to speak on, let's just call it business, and you want to talk about the corporate world, high executive topics. Well, they're not going to understand that because they haven't been in that corporate world. But that was your speech. You memorized it that way. You're doing the speech that way. It was written out and all that good stuff. And so now you're stuck doing that. And now you can't connect with that audience because of that. But if we just stuck with an outline, while yes, we may still talk about business in a super senior level, big corporation kind of thing, we can break that down and talk to that audience because now we are focused on that audience. Now, with your memorized speech, you probably are going to try and focus in on that audience. But the other thing is that if things come up or you start to hear stuff, you won't be able to change in the moment. And that's what professional speakers do. It's not that we're unprepared. It's that we are prepared with a lot of information and see things and hear things as we're going to speak and as we speak to people in the crowd where we're going to speak at and realize, oh, you know what? That would be good to put into my speech. And so you add that in, but when it's memorized, you can't do that. And therefore, you're not able to connect because you are stuck with a very rigid speech. And the second part is that it is so rigid. When it is rigid or regimented so much, you also can't connect. There's not the emotion there. And yes, you can memorize and build in that emotion. And as you're getting angry, you start like throwing your hands down, or you really get excited and you lift your voice up, you lift your hands up, your eyes go up, all of that stuff. You can build that into a memorized speech. But the thing is, that memorized speech will be so regimented, it's going to be hard for in the moment for you to be able to stop. Because guess what? If you put a zinger or a funny joke or story into your speech, and all of a sudden everybody's just like, ha, 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 and they keep laughing and keep laughing. At some point, of course, you have to interrupt them. But if you were expecting like a ha ha, and so you only had like a 2-second pause put in there, and they reacted a certain way, and you're like, wow, maybe I want to double down on this. Now you can't because you are so regimented and you're stuck with that. Or it completely throws you off your pace because you were expecting that they weren't going to laugh so hard and you weren't going to need to take as long of a pause. So it's just too regimented when it comes to having a memorized speech. The third part is you're only focused on what's coming next. You're not focused in on your audience. You're not focused in on what you're at in the moment. And if you've ever had a conversation with somebody that you can tell they have some kind of script that they're following or an agenda that they're following, you can tell when they're basically, hey, I want to cover this. And they throw it out there and they're just like listening to you because they basically just wanted to tell you what they were going to tell you. And they didn't want to have any feedback. They didn't want to have any dialogue. And that was it. And they're just wait until that next point. And then finally they go to the next point. And you can tell that because they have an agenda. And your audience can tell that same thing when all you're doing is focused on your speech and it's exactly how you practice it. And it could be flawless. It could be an amazing speech. But your audience can tell when you're being a little bit more natural with things versus when it's something that you're very regimented to. We can think of military people. They might stand at attention, the hands behind their back, or maybe they're actually saluting at the time. But we can tell that military people, because of how they stand, typically it looks a little stiff. It's not relaxed. They don't have a hand in a pocket or things like that. And I'm not saying one way is right or wrong in that situation, just giving you an example of military people that look a little bit more stiff because they are there standing at attention. They're waiting for the next command kind of thing. And so for you, having your speech memorized makes it where all you're doing is going from point 1 to point 2 to point 3, and you're simply only focused in on that. Now, the flow will be a lot better most likely because if you're not a professional speaker, because you have it memorized and you know what's coming next. But the thing with that as well is if you get lost, which is point 4, if you get lost in your speech at some point or you skip over a point, you're going to be lost because you had the speech memorized and, oh, crap, I forgot to say that one line, or I forgot to tell the joke, or I meant to mention this story and I'd already moved on. I forgot. And now your brain is like, oh, what do I do? What do I do? You're freaking out. So you're going to be lost if you have that memorized speech. But if you just memorized your outline and then you really essentially you've been practicing, you have ideas what you're going to talk about, but you're able to be flexible because you don't literally have every word memorized and written down and reading off that speech, perhaps if you have your paper at the podium and everything. But when you skip a part, it's going to throw you off. Versus if you didn't have the whole speech memorized and just your outline, you know the things that you're going to cover. You have your theme that you have and your supporting points and maybe some stories with that you want to share, and you're able to get back on the path because you just have a generic roadmap, much like a GPS. If you use Google or Apple Maps, when you get off the path that it first laid out for you, it will reroute you back on to the path to get you back on the most efficient, fastest, whatever choice you decide. It'll get you back on that path eventually, even though you may have veered off. And that's what your outline does for you. But in a memorized speech, it's more difficult to get back on path, and it won't seem as smooth as a transition. And just to give an example of this, when we think of podcasts, you go down rabbit holes a lot of times, but then you pull back out and you go on to the next thing. With the memorized speech, you can't necessarily go down those rabbit holes, which would be you got lost and you're trying to make your way back. But when you have just the outline memorized, you can go and veer off the path and then slowly make your way back. Create an application or create a segue back into what it is that you were talking about in the first place. And so having a memorized speech will actually harm you more than it will help you. So to really go back and just summarize here, answering that question of should you memorize your entire speech? No. Should you memorize the outline of your speech? Yes. So if you're getting prepared for your next speech, what I would do is not write out your entire speech. I would not memorize your entire speech. What I would do is find the overarching theme. What is this main idea that I want to talk about? And then create 3 supporting points for that main idea, and then have some stories that you can share within those points. 1 for each point, roughly speaking, depends on how long you're going for. And this is, of course, a generic outline. If you're going to need to modify it for your speech, the environment that you're in and everything, but create some stories that support those supporting points and give emphasis to that and give some clarity on that. And that is how you should go about memorizing, I say quotes, memorizing a outline and not the speech. Do not memorize the whole speech, because you will not be connected to your audience, number 1. Number 2, it'll be regimented and come off, again, as not emotional. You're not going to get that connection with your audience. And there's so many things that will just not feel right for that audience. It won't feel natural. 3, you'll only be focused on what's coming next. You're not going to be there in the moment. And when you're not in the moment, people don't feel that sense of belonging and feel like you're there trying to give them that. You're already moved on to the next thing. And then number 4, if you mess up, you're going to get lost. And it's going to happen. Things happen on stage. You can't control everything, but what you can control is having your speech set up in a way that if there's a hiccup, you get distracted, you lose your train of thought, you can get back on because you have a general outline rather than a very regimented, memorized speech.